Hello and welcome to the second in the series of Economics A-level podcasts for the Pig School from me, Mr. Pearce. Last time I spoke about the state of the UK macroeconomy, our 4 macro objectives. You're going to constantly need to relate what is going on in the world to your exams. And today I would like to go through those exams or that exam structure. At the end of your 2 years studying economics, you will have 3 exams, each 2 hours long, to prove what you know, to show the examiner what you know. So each of those exams are 2 hours long. You will have one on microeconomics, one on macroeconomics, and one on micro and macroeconomics. So it's going to be a mix of the two. For the micro and macro exams, there will be a distinct split in the papers. So you'll have one side which is a data response question, you'll have 2 data response questions, and you need to choose which one you are most comfortable with answering, and you should always base that on the 25 mark question. So which of the 25 mark questions do you find most accessible, easiest to do, understandable? You might have done a previous one where you think that's pretty similar. And then you will have an essay. So the essay, you will have a choice of 3. It will be 15 and 25 marks. And again, you pick a whole question. So you can't do 15 marker from one, 25 from the other. So you do the 15 and 25 mark question as a set. And again, you base that on the 25 mark question, which is most accessible, which is easiest, which you might be most comfortable with what they're testing. For each one, for the data response and the essay, there are set things that you need to include in each of your answers. So with the data response, and this is for the micro and the macro, you'll have a 2 mark question, a 4 mark question, a 9 mark question, and a 25 mark question. So I'll go through each of those and what you need to include for each to score top marks to impress the examiners. So in the 2 mark question, it will be a calculation question. So work out the average, work out the percentage change. It might be an adding up of sort of market shares, a concentration ratio. But you don't need to explain anything. You work it out using a calculator. You put the units in, and if it says to 2 decimal places, do 2 decimal places, that kind of thing. But there's no extra writing, extra additional things you need to do for that one. For the 4 mark question, it'll again be looking at and interpreting some data. So you have a graph, a chart. You will need to use that data. I would suggest picking out a couple of things that are in that data. So it could be a high point, a low point, the trend of that data, is it going up or down? Is there a big anomaly? Do they follow each other? Do they correlate? So I would pick out 2 bits of data. You need to use the units. So is it in pounds sterling? Is it in grams of corn if it's micro? Is it percentage for GDP? And then you need to make what I call an economic comment. So just a very short 1-2 line observation. This shows me that higher consumer spending does lead to greater GDP growth, something like that if it was macro. In the 9 mark question, you'll have normally it will say to draw a graph, but even if it doesn't, you will need to draw one. So you'll need to define something at the start. So it might be a good idea to take that from the question if there's an economic term in the question. You will need to explain. So if it's asking for 2 reasons that the price of corn has gone up, you will need to use the data, which is the next bit, a quote from the data, to explain why. And you have to have a diagram. So if it's a micro one, remember your elasticities, always label correctly and explain. So you need the diagrams, got to be there, but it can't be there in isolation. It's going to need some explanation as to what it shows. You'll then have a 25 mark question, which I've already said is what you should base your choice of question on. And you'll need to follow this really as a checkpoint list of what needs to be included. So you should have an introduction, whether it's microeconomics or macroeconomics. You're going to need to say a short 1-2 lines saying, this is what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at whether inflation or deflation is the bigger problem. I'm going to look at the best way to solve the problem of obesity. It's then a good idea to define something. Again, it should be economical. So if you've mentioned alcohol, you might define negative externality. If you've looking at how to solve inflation, obviously you would define inflation. You will need at least one diagram, but you're not penned to one diagram. It might be 2, 3 diagrams if you've got time. So those diagrams are the first thing an examiner will see. So you need to make sure those diagrams are big, you need to make sure those diagrams are clear, correctly labelled, and then very importantly that they are explained and referenced. They've got to be in context of the answer, not just a standalone diagram. Then it differs a little on whether you're doing your micro or macro paper, but you should be looking at making 3 points. So if it's a how to solve alcohol, cigarette consumption, you would look at 3 ways to solve that problem: tax, information, subsidising healthy alternatives. If it looking at something like if it's macro, how to get out of a recession, you would look at 3 different policies, maybe cut income tax, cut corporation tax, or cut interest rates. So you need to make 3 points and explain each of them. This is where your chain of reasoning comes in. So you need to explain what impacts what. So you want to explain as much as you can. And then the last 3 things, but these should all be mixed up. We've done, or if you haven't yet, we will be doing perfect paragraphs in lesson. You should have bits of data. You must quote the data. Extract B says make it explicit, make it as obvious as possible to the examiner what you're doing. And you need evaluation. This is where your high B grades and A grades come in. You must evaluate. So you must say why the policy might not work. You might say the drawbacks of it. You might say the people that don't benefit from it. If it's micro, look at government failure. If it's macro, you're looking at the downsides, the people that might not do as well from it. And you cannot score level 5, which is the top level. You're sort of 20 marks and above for a 25 mark question. You cannot score into level 5 if you don't have a conclusion. So even if it's a short, sharp conclusion of 2 lines, you should always put that in the final few minutes of your paper. For the essays, for the 15 and 25 markers, I won't go through the whole structure again because it's pretty similar, but your 15 marker, you're looking at definition, 2 or 3 points that you're making, and a diagram where all the same rules apply. You should label it correctly, discuss it, and make sure it's relevant, explain it. And in the 25 mark question, pretty much exactly the same structure that I've just gone through that you're going to want to approach it as: your introduction, definition, diagram, points, but you haven't got any data to work off of. So in this one, you're looking at UK knowledge. So for micro, you're looking at current examples. So the French government recently saying they want to ban all petrol cars by 2040. That is a real world example. For your macro, you're looking at what I went through in last time's podcast. You're looking at what's currently happening to inflation, what are the current policies the government are using. And you still need to evaluate and conclude in the same way. So you'll do, as a recap, for micro and macro, these will all be on separate days in the exam. For micro, you'll be picking 1 data response. You'll do a 2, 4, 9, 25, and you'll be doing 1 set of essays, 15 and 25 mark question. It'll be 1 hour for each. Timing is incredibly important. You should practice doing your homeworks, your exam homeworks in timed conditions. If not straight away, train yourself, cut the amount of time down. So if it's taking you 1 hour and 10 minutes, cut it down to 1 hour and 5, then 1 hour for each one. Other key points for the data response: you should not be start to answer any questions until you have read the data, read the questions, and gone through and highlighted the data. What is it that it wants you to do? So you don't want to just start writing. It's better to write a shorter answer about what the examiner wants rather than a long answer just about all you know about economics, because you will not be given marks just for what you're showing in terms of economic knowledge unless it's relevant to the question. Your last paper will be paper 3. Paper 3 is a different structure. So paper 3, you'll have 30 multiple choice questions. So these multiple choice questions will be a mix of micro and macro. For this year's paper, there were 16 macro, 14 micro, so it'll be pretty much an even split. And we would have done many past practice papers of these. But when answering the multiple choices, need to remember there is an exam technique cross out answers that it definitely isn't. So if you're looking down your 4 answers and you think that's definitely it, cross it out, put an X next to it. You can define in your head. So if the question mentions merit good, you should be thinking, underconsumed. If it's an elasticity or any kind of calculation question calculating GDP changes, you will have your calculator with you. You must work it out. There's going to be no shortcuts, so you're going to need to work it out. And if it's shifting of curves, again, micro and macro, draw little sketch diagrams next to it to make sure you get the right answer. So with the paper 3, you've got 2 hours like the others. For the multiple choice questions, some will take longer than others. So it's probably, you're looking at 40 minutes probably for all of the multiple choice questions. But don't worry if you're looking, some of the working out ones might take you 2 or 3 minutes, but then there'll be others where you just look at it and go, right, that's the definition, I can put that down. So it should take you about 45 minutes for the multiple choice, which will leave you 1 hour and 15 minutes to answer the 3 questions. The big difference with the paper 3 is that in the paper 3, it is a mix of micro and macroeconomics. So you're going to need to draw diagrams from both. You're going to need to discuss theories from both, definitions from both, examples from both. You will have a 10-mark question, a 15-mark question, and a 25-mark question. In the 10-mark question, in the paper 3, you'll get an extracts booklet where you'll get 5 or 6 bits of data that will be charts, graphs for the first 3 or 4, and then you'll have 2 or 3 long bits of written data. So what the 10-mark question will ask you, the first one, is to interpret some of the data from the beginning tables. So what you'll need to do is to pick out 3 points from that data. So this data or this table shows me this. Again, use units and make sure you're being accurate. But the difference is you need to critique or evaluate it. So you might say that this data shows me that UK average house prices have been going up by 200% since 2000. But you would then need to go on to say, however, in other bits of data, it says that this is only in the southeast, or you might say what the data doesn't fully tell you. You could say, however, that this might just be for 4-bedroom houses. We don't know, it's not for 3-bedroom houses. So you need to make sure you're giving an evaluation. And then a short 1 or 2 line conclusion. For the 15-mark question, very similar to the 15-mark 9-mark and 15-mark questions for the essay and data, you will need to define 2 points explained and evaluated. So just give a quick what's on the other side, and ideally a micro and macro point, but it does depend on how the question is framed. And then on the 25-mark question, very similar to the other 2 25-mark questions, but you have longer to write. So if you've got more time, they want you to write more. And remembering back to paper 3 is a mix. You will need to write micro and macro points in that 25. So as well as the usual introduction, definition, diagrams, and when you get to the amount of points you're looking at, really you need 4 points. Ideally 2 micro, 2 macro, but time will be pressured. If you do 2 micro or 2 macro, make sure the third one is more inclined to the one you've missed out. There's also a huge wealth of data in the paper 3, so you need to be quoting as much data as possible. And to get those high Bs and A grades, you need to use numerical data. So you'll need to use the table, charts, graphs, but you'll need some numbers in there. You'll also need to evaluate, as you did in the others, and then come up with a conclusion. Remember, you cannot get to those level 5, those top above 20, unless you conclude. And that's how you answer A-level exam questions. So that's all from me today.